The dusky moon had gone out. The blinds sat empty, dull, with no sky behind them. But the phone screen remained, and quiet waves, and the sucking embrace of a hotel mattress. Ted shifted, pressed send. I do love you.
Sorry, I know. I love you too. How much?
More than the open roads and ocean, keeping me up all night.
I shouldn't be keeping you up.
The waves are.
Close your window, then.
I like it open. Well, the waves remind me of how we met. I have a show tomorrow, then I'll bring you a souvenir.
I want to custody with you. I want to think I used to have this right.
The first time.
Good. My texting is getting better, right?
We can call if you like. Definitely.
Oh, I like this.
Yeah, you were practically feral when we met.
Shut up. I do miss the food. Something to eat would be fine.
Alright. There's good food here.
No seafood. Poultry. With the pretty girls you've met on tour.
Ted pulled the comforter around his armpits. There aren't any, and I'm not on tour.
No. Sorry, you've been gone too long.
Tomorrow's the last show, then I'll get you something and come right back. And no pretty girls. I think about you, and crack, they vanish.
True. Come on, though. You should shut the window.
It was the silence which woke him. Ted sat upright in hollow darkness. His hand scrabbled at the bedside table and found the touch slick. That was only his own sweat. He found the phone. No new messages. Sleep wouldn't take him back. An indeterminable period of time passed before he realized what was wrong. He got up and closed the window again. Hello and welcome, or welcome back, to this newish series where I perform some of my very best short horror aloud for you. Today we're reading Souvenir, a story about existential terror and true love. An older version of Souvenir was published in Literally Stories on October 11th, 2022, though several revisions have been made since then. Be advised, this story contains elements some may find disturbing. And with that, let's get back to the story. Ted was only a little too drunk at the after party, half on wine and half on half and half stardom. He felt light in his cheap loafers, long coat, and short graying hair, which was premature aging, not age. The night smelled cool and nutty and of tomato sauce. They'd gone to a charming Italian place, Brick, with a jaunty neon sign and a cheery bell. Pink and yellow lanterns were strung up on the patio around them. There was food, but mostly wine. It was late now, though, and only 3 others remained, 2 women and 1 man. You like wild, exotic pets like parrots? Laura questioned. The other woman, Clara, who was hawkish and quiet as a rule, raised an eyebrow. Ted shook his head. I'm interested in big cats, though, not as pets. You can't treat a wild animal like a pet. But a parrot could repeat your jokes, and you could take it on the road with you, right? This was Chris, Laura's fiancé. Chris was the type of guy Ted hated. Broad as a bull, he was the kind who couldn't sleep at night, who tapped his foot in the perpetual motion of ever-fraying nerves. Ted wondered if Chris knew Laura was going to leave someday, ring or not. You couldn't take a parrot on the road, Laura said. You probably could, Ted said, but I'm interested in big cats. Sure, Chris said, but you hear about rich bastards getting eaten by their own tigers all the time, and you couldn't bring a lady over 'cause it might eat them too. Darling, we are rich bastards, Laura said. Not tiger rich. Well, why don't you get a cat instead? Clara asked. It'd be hard taking a tiger around the state with you anyway. And there is something uncomfortable about it, Laura mused. You know, I wouldn't marry Chris if he bought a pet tiger. Clara nodded, as if she understood why Chris might buy a tiger. and why Laura would leave him for it. It's not legal here, Ted said. You'd have to go to Idaho or Nevada, but yes, it would be difficult. He smiled at Clara. I wouldn't want a tiger, really. I'm joking. Well, you are a joke, man, Chris said with a belch. But this is too much. Too close to philosophy. If I wanted to philosophize, I'd read Peter's Manifesto. I majored in philosophy, dear. Dear, was there something we had to do when we got home? No? Should there be? Thank God we're not having children. Yes, of course, Ted said. Nice night, isn't it? Reminds me of the confluence, Clara agreed, looking at him. Her eyes cut like twin moons in a clear sky. They were the kind of falcon eyes which saw everything. She looked familiar. A smile fluttered below as if she, like him, was silently laughing at their companions. She had a little mouth which flashed little teeth and wore a ruddy jacket with a flower sewn onto the breast in yellow thread. There was a black dress under that and curling black hair over it. It had gotten cold and she breathed in the currency of small clouds. They both blinked. Clara looked away and continued, I mean, it's so clear, but the stars are dim, and the moon almost yellow. It's easy to imagine a second one appearing again. Oh, don't start with urban legends. I don't care for them, Laura said. They're not real. Why should you care? Chris asked. Thousands of people saw it, Ted pointed out. The government made a statement. There are pictures as well. Hardly an urban legend. The pictures are bull. People just photoshopped them afterwards. I saw it, Clara said, looking at Ted, who took out his phone. And I took a picture. Look here, Chris. I bet you made it up too. No, look. You can see the location and timestamp. Phones keep track of these things now. And Ted passed him the picture. It was of a beach at night. The waves were frozen in time, the stars very dim, and the sky very clear. There were 2 yellowing moons in the sky, illuminating the scene, one slightly larger than the other. Laura shuddered, but leaned to look also. Chris squinted. Bellingham, Washington, Friday, February 29th, 2028. You really do have a picture. Clara stiffened a little, which Ted noticed but didn't understand yet. Then Laura gasped. There's someone in the picture. Look, they're hard to see, but look on the left. It's like they're walking out of the water. It was Ted's turn to stiffen. That had been the wrong picture. Creepy. Who's that? Chris asked. He almost lied, but stopped. Clara had falcon eyes. Oh, that's just my fiancé. Laura frowned. You didn't mention having one. What were you, skinny dipping? Don't look, Chris. No, actually. Ted took the phone back. That's the day we met. I didn't even notice her while I was taking the picture. Cute, Laura said, still shivering. Well, I'm ready to go home. She smacked her crimson lips and wrapped the puffer jacket Chris had been wearing at one point tighter around herself. The shell flashed. Fish scales. We should call it a night, babe. It is night, Chris said, sipping his wine as if in deep thought. Then let's go home. She leaned into Chris and whispered something more. The man hesitated, and Laura took that for assent. She rose to her feet and started waving for a check. Ted turned to Clara. I'm still awake. You want to walk for a bit? Maybe you could show me around town before I leave. Clara hesitated, but nodded. That sounds nice, though I haven't lived here long myself. Let me go to the bathroom, and then we can leave. She left. It seemed like Chris was about to ask something. Perhaps insist that he and Laura stay longer and talk. Stay a lot longer and talk. Ted leaned to the other man and whispered, Sour about the kids? I could hook you up with a tiger. Chris flushed and stood. He and Laura paid for dinner and then left. Ted's phone vibrated. Of course. I might have to drive tomorrow morning, actually.
Is it a bad selection? Have you been drinking?
Not really a bad selection, just hard to choose.
Ted, don't drive if you're drunk.
I won't.
Well, do whatever. I'll leave you to it. Hope to see you tonight. Love you, Ted.
Love you too. He was shaking and sweating so badly he barely had time to put his phone away and compose himself as Clara came back onto the patio. The air was potential, was heat, was the threatening hum of Emissary 6G in his pocket. They were walking close, tipsy shoulders playing a deadly game. The scent of the bar and restaurant hung around them, basil and human bodies and sweat and laughter drenched in a brown light. You watched me during your show. Clara's voice was quiet now. Well, you can't tell jokes to a crowd. You watched me the entire time. You were watching me, Ted said, carefully watching the dark shopfronts. Clara laughed. I was in the back row. You looked familiar. Ted stopped and examined one of the dark windows. There was a jewelry stand. The cheap necklace had a blue raindrop pendant. A bit morbid, that one, isn't it? Clara said. You looking to get your fiancé a souvenir tomorrow morning? Ted shook his head. I think I've already got one. He patted his coat pocket. Their footsteps turned to gritty hisses, then wood thumps, as they left the street behind, moved to a sandy path, and then a pier over the water. It was endless sea and endless sky. They were small. The moon was full. I've seen you before, Clara admitted. I saw you perform in Bellingham, actually, the night of the confluence. Ted nearly tripped. What? Clara stopped for him. At the Upfront. You were part of their improv group then. I used to come to the shows a lot when I lived in Bellingham. That picture was Boulevard Park, right? It was. I used to live in Bellingham as well. The memory was back in him now. He and Clara had met after the show, even talked for a brief moment before her roommate came to pull her away. He'd liked her, but they hadn't exchanged numbers. He'd gone to Boulevard to commiserate, but then, well, everything changed. Next time I asked the other performers about you, but they said you'd left town. It must be lonely traveling so much now, Clara said. Until you get home? Oh, it's lonely there as well sometimes. You must be lonely out here. Didn't you tell me you grew up in Bellingham? Yeah, I barely know anyone. I work remote for Emissary, actually. Sometimes I think the only person who would miss me if I skipped town is the grocery clerk. She laughed. They stopped at the end of the dock. The pilings were fresh, still hopeful against the brine. When she laughed, it was not clouds that came out, but galaxies. A whole different world. She wasn't pretty. It was something else. The moonlit darkness and small jacket did little to hide the limp she walked with, or the way her eyes cast aside, as often as straight ahead, or the faint scarring of acne across her right cheek. Clara wasn't very pretty, but perhaps she was very human. How wonderful. He looked away. It's getting late, Ted noted. What will it be? She asked. My place, your hotel, the car, the beach? Waves kissed into dark planks. Ted looked at her despite himself. I can't. Clara sighed. Of course. Why didn't you leave? Because you told me to walk with you. I shouldn't have done that. I can't. I can't. Clara, I can't. And there was the gravitational heat, which comes from using the name of a stranger so intimately. But this was familiar. She was just how he remembered her. But he was different. Ted understood this conversation at every level and knew how it would end. There's no one on this dock but us, Ted. Turn your phone off. Her voice moved, small and fast, but without much hope. His fist was clenched so tight that a nail cut his palm. Let's go back to my car. He'd parked by the beach lot preemptively. It was small and out of the way. They approached, and Clara hitched her breath, still shaking off surprise. She looked around, nervous. Ted opened the backseat door but stopped her. I can't, but I can give you something. A souvenir. Oh? What is it? A lock of your hair? The disappointment was back. She seemed almost relieved in a twisted way. Her keen eyes cast aside. Ted didn't answer, just bent into the car and started looking. What's she like? He was searching blind because the light in his car had never worked. Clara was behind him, and then she moved, leaning against the trunk. He glanced at her, shuddering back through the rear windshield. Vast, he said. An ocean of perfect crystal. She must be very beautiful. There was no bitterness in her. Well, she is, but that's not what I meant. You must be happy. There was no bitterness, only an awful gray solitude, a resignation deeper than any ocean, wider than any sky could ever be. And Ted guessed that Clara, too, had played in this scene many times and was used to an ending. But this ending would be different. For her. I often am happy. And so the story ends without change, she said in a shuddery voice. You know that's called an anticlimax? But Clara didn't see the ending clearly. Or him, not really. As Ted found the heavy bat he kept under the seat, then he clambered from the car and struck the crying woman cleanly in the side of her head. You awake?
Yes, maybe
4 hours.
will you be alright? Good grief, it will be dawn by then.
I don't want to fall asleep. Unless next to you.
Are you bringing me something to eat then?
Yes, I know you get hangry otherwise.
Hello? Pretty?
He flicked on the blinker and then merged into the carpool lane. It was listed as 2+, after all. Ted wanted to vomit. That was a good joke. He should write it down. Yes.
Honesty is sexy. Put on a kettle. Put something in the oven so you don't starve.
He dropped the phone into the passenger seat. Ted wasn't sure what he was crying for, but it was probably that twisted kind of relief. Pre-dawn cracked the sky open like a skull as he pulled into their very average suburban drive. The garage door clattered, and Ted rolled forward. She was waiting for him, huge and deep as the ocean, though not very tall. She had on a purple sundress and hair the color of dark spaces between bright stars. Her jaw was muscled and perfect. They embraced. When she moved, it was the sound of waves. She smelled like salt, and they fit together in a way they hadn't always done. A muffled banging could be heard from inside the trunk. She looked at Ted with a mixture of lust and surprise, almost awe. You brought me a live one. He nodded and passed her the car keys. She took them with greedy, bladed fingers. Her black eyes slid off him and onto the rattling trunk. Ted had hoped Clara might die from the bat, because he couldn't bring himself to strangle her. He'd always known that weakness was adjacent to cruelty. "Coffee on the counter?" he asked. She affirmed, drifting toward the trunk. Her finger savored the act of depressing the remote. And that traitorous compartment opened with a wet chuckle and the noise of indescribable terror. Ted shut the door behind him fast. On the kitchen floor, there was a tuft of short blonde hair still attached to someone's scalp. Ted threw it in the trash. If you lived with a stray tiger, you should expect to find the remains of a mouse every now and then. He poured coffee, then took a knife and cut up the mushroom and spinach quiche she had made. The walls were terrible and thin. He lay awake in the bedroom for 2 hours before she finished and joined him. Her hair was wet, and she wore a t-shirt and blue jorts. She slid under the covers. Her lavender shampoo was thick. The shower had washed off the iron juice, the yellow snot, and the purple tears, and left her damp in a not unpleasant way. She'd gotten better at cleaning up. "Thank you. What are you doing in bed? It's halfway to noon." You said you wouldn't sleep without me beside you. But you're not tired." "I'll read a book." She smiled and kissed him. There was something between her teeth. After they separated, he felt inside his own mouth with 2 fingers. Wait. There it was. Ted pulled the lock of hair from his tongue. It was black and curly.